Thank you for that nice introduction, and thank you again for the opportunity of moderating this distinguished panel of artists who have various ways of looking at partition. They look at many other things as well, but we are now bringing them together to talk about the 1947 partition of British India and the way in which their work interacts and reverberates with that phenomenon, which all of them are familiar with. And I am very pleased to introduce the panel, which is distinguished, coming from afar, but hopefully they'll feel close to you as we proceed. And their interest in partition really arises from an interest in understanding its impact and disruptive effects on the subcontinent, but perhaps also in farther reaches of the world, because the notion of a partition is not foreign to other countries, other histories, but it is front and center in the history of the subcontinent in the 20th century, and it continues to have its impact on the populations who have descended from those who experienced it. And this is in the grasp of art, both expression and visual and productive art. And these three experts, in their own inimitable ways, will be talking to you about partition, perhaps not directly, but you will hear what they're saying, and I think it's going to be most instructive. So for the audience, I would just like to note that the forced migration that was precipitated by the partition of British India in 1947 began in 1946 and actually came to a substantive end in terms of the enormity of need and the millions moving by mid-1948. It was a cataclysmic event that the British in some ways anticipated, in many ways were blind to, and it therefore became an unmanaged, very complex process of communal antagonism, communal violence, political indecision, which aggravated everybody's thought process, and has, under the sort of formal studies of a number of people in the last 25 years, come to be seen as the largest instance of forced migration ever recorded in world history. That remains the case even though there are now millions and actually billions more people on Earth than there were in 1947. And there have been extreme wars of violence and partition of peoples in the subsequent 75 years since partition. Regardless, partition still is the greatest instance. By greatest, I'm talking now about numbers, and this is focused on the Punjab, numbers who crossed the border one way or the other in that period, from early 1947 into mid-1948. The numbers were approximately 18 million people. We have not had a forced migration of 18 million people since, and hopefully we will not. And the numbers killed, again, these are based on recent studies and release of files, not really release, but interrogation of files, particularly on the side of the Pakistani police files, would suggest that between 2.3 and 3.5 million people were killed. Now, these data come from several studies, both of them involving indirect census estimates, as well as files that have been uncovered. And there is a growing body of people who are studying partition, who are recognizing this phenomenon as such an extraordinary loss of life and circumstance for people. Now, the ways in which partition is experienced and evinced in people's behaviors and sets of the future and the past, currently in the subcontinent, are myriad. And it's totally appropriate that we would find artists who can speak to the negative, but also the positive, or the mixed and somewhat dissonant ways in which populations now look back at partition and look now at each other and look into a future. And it's these thoughts and approaches to this cataclysmic event that we've invited our artist colleagues to reflect upon, knowing that they have all, from their own vantage points, studied and struggled with the materials that they find the most interesting. Now, the bios of our speakers are on the website. They're on the materials available to you. But let me just introduce them. And in the order that I'm introducing them, also I would ask that that be the order in which they speak. Our first speaker, therefore, is Professor Iftikhar Dadi, who is the John H. Burns Professor in the History of Art at Cornell University. Our second speaker is Professor Nadhra Khan, visiting faculty at the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Lahore University of Management Sciences. And our third panelist is Professor Bhaskar Sarkar, who is in the Department of Film and Media Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara. So here I will simply welcome them to the proceedings. You will get a sense of them as they speak and show what they're thinking about, and approximately 10 minutes for each speaker. And at that point, I will intrude again to moderate. And I would ask that Professor Dadi, would you please take the floor and talk to us about your work?
Thank you, Jennifer, and thank you to Mittal Institute for the invitation to this panel. And I'm very happy to be on this panel with Bhaskar and Nadhra. I would like to share my screen, and let me see if I'm allowed to do that. Or yes, okay. And let's see. Can you see the screen now, which says lines of control?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Okay. So my interest in the partition is both scholarly and artistic, and in a professional sense, of course, but it's also deeply personal. Both my parents and much of their extended families hail from India. My mother from the UP and my father from Bombay, and they moved to Pakistan in the wake of the partition. So as an artist, my engagement legacy of partition began with a meeting in 1996 at an exhibition in Copenhagen. Partition, which is the exactly opposite journey to my father. We discussed an alternative celebration of the 50th anniversary of the independence of India and Pakistan, as well as the partition in 1997. And we made a joint work together, which I'll show you. Our collaboration also resulted in a larger group exhibition titled Mappings, which traveled actually to between New Delhi, Bombay, and Lahore. And we developed an artwork, as I mentioned, called Bloodlines, which I'll show you. And as an artist, I've also collaborated with my partner, Elizabeth Dadi, for 20 years. And there's another body of work, a more recent body of work called Efflorescence, which I'll be talking about as well. But I wanted to just circle back to the comments that Jennifer made about the importance of artistic practice, and filmmakers, and of course writers, filmmakers, musicians, and artists, and their importance in us in thinking about the question of the partition and its kind of legacies, into the present. So in visual arts, in painting and so on, the modernist artists actually did tackle the partition, but it was somewhat oblique. One can think of people like Satish Gujral and Tayyab Mehta, for example. But when you come to the second generation and subsequent generations, or the contemporary artists, they're actually much more engaged in a very different register, I would argue. And this vital work, of artists and filmmakers and so on or the aesthetic dimension of life in South Asia is, I would argue, radically political, in the sense that it allows us to imaginatively and effectively participate in a universe where, a narrow sense of being and belonging is challenged, and one sense is invited to be enhanced in kind of open-ended and some, even uncomfortable ways. And in the arena of contemporary art, this crucial work is being performed by artists, curators, writers, galleries, and museums, whether located in South Asia or elsewhere, and is therefore of really great significance. Art provides us and the successive generations with intellectual and affective resources for rethinking our stances. And these effects may have immediate, kind of results, or they may be latent, proleptic, or prophetic. So from this perspective, it doesn't matter whether the art is accessible or difficult, how widely the work circulates, or what the specific identity of the artist is. In some ways, the artwork is as much a gambit into, into the conditions today as it is a promise and a resource for tomorrow. Contemporary artists, by a growing number of South Asian artists, most of whom did not experience firsthand either 1947 or 1971 in the case of Pakistan and Bangladesh, is now beginning to grapple with this, complex effects of partition or partition effects, which extends from grand nationalist, geopolitical, and identitarian agendas into the most personal and intimate aspects of the self. So let me begin by showing you a few images from an exhibition I had the privilege of co-curating. This was an exhibition called Lines of Control, and it showed at the Herbert Johnson Museum at Cornell University, and then traveled to Duke University's National Museum. This was a large exhibition, and I don't have time to talk about all the work in it. The curators were Ahmad Nasser, myself, Ellen Averill, and Nadhra. There is a good catalog and reader called which you can find on Amazon or in libraries. So at its core, this exhibition investigates the historic upheaval of the 1947 partition. But in this exhibition, we also addressed other partitioned areas, which is also something Jennifer mentioned. And we had actually artistic projects on North and South Korea, Sudan and South Sudan, Israel and Palestine, Ireland and Northern Ireland, Armenia and its diasporas, and indigenous sovereignty in the United States. It explored the products and remainders of partition and the modern nation state, the continued impact of kind of colonization, the physical and psychic violence of displacement, dilemmas of identity and belonging, and questions of commemoration. So I'll just show you a few works from this. The first work I'll show you is by a Sri Lankan artist whose name is Muhammad Qadir. And he's made these two paintings called Flag 1 and Flag 2. These are oil paintings, but they're exactly the size of the international flag, that you find in the United Nations and so on, of nation states. And here's a close-up of Flag 1. And it's really, what it does is it resembles a tricolor flag with the three bands of color, but it's also a landscape painting where you see you see the sky, you see water, and you see land, right? So in some ways, what it does is it conflates, or kind of in a sense asks questions about the relationship between ascribing territory to borders and to kind of nation states. The second work is by the printmaker Zarina Hashmi. Zarina Hashmi has passed away, but she was her life was also very much shaped by partition, and this is a question that she grappled with all her life. This particular dividing line is the Radcliffe line that divides the India and Pakistan border, and the way it's a print, a woodcut. And in the woodcut, you see the kind of vibration or the kind of instability of the line, which is made through the markings of the way the work is made. Shilpa Gupta is an Indian artist based in Bombay. And what she does is in this work is that it's a work that is made with tape. And it's a poem written in the shape of a flag as well, in which she says, I tried very hard to cut the sky in half, one for my lover and one for me, but the sky kept moving and clouds from his territory came into mine. I tried pushing it away with both my hands, harder and harder, but the sky kept moving and clouds from my territory went into his. I brought a sofa and placed it in the middle, but the clouds kept floating over it. I built a wall in the middle, but the sky started to flow through it. I dug a trench and then it rained and the sky made clouds over the trench. I tried very hard to cut the sky in half. So it's again a kind of a poetic statement, but I think in the light of today's concerns also, the question of environmental, the shared environmental disasters that South Asia is suffering from, I think also is evoked. The work is made by a tape that she made, which resembles the police line, do not cross tape. Okay, so it's made by pasting this tape that says there is no border here. Ehsan Kamal is a miniature painter from Pakistan, and what he's done is he's made two little miniatures, very tiny circular works, and the work says "Kaho na pyar hai," which is, it's a sort of a filmy, way of saying, isn't there love between us? And it shows two soldiers who are kind of dressed up in their kind of regalia and plumage. Okay. And we don't know, if these soldiers are Pakistani soldiers or Indian soldiers. But of course, before the partition, they were both part of the British colonial army, right? So they were basically part of the same army. So again, this portraiture, the kind of the celebration of a kind of an identity that is militarized, but then also that. This is a shot from the exhibition installation, but I wanted to talk about the work on the wall, which looks like this claw. Okay, so the claw is actually the Punjab, right? These are the 5 rivers of
Iftikhar, you're breaking up. I'm not sure. Yeah, it's coming off. Why don't we suggest that we move on to the next speaker? And Iftikhar, when you come back on, I will certainly include you in the commentary and the discussion, okay? And in front of us is someone who was deeply steeped in the films and cinematography around partition. And welcome and thank you for being here. Please.
Okay, great. Thanks to the Mittal Institute for inviting me. Wish I could have been there, but it's a bit problem traveling around these days. So, I want to start with a film called Shabnam, which came out in 1949, and it was produced by the relatively new studio, Filmistan. And the very name of this studio immediately refers back to Pakistan and Hindustan, right? So they were thinking of a space where they could get over these territorial divisions and imagine a realm of belonging that was common to both countries. Shabnam is particularly interesting for the way it begins to put together something like a genre. It's a heist caper film, and it features Dilip Kumar and Kamini Kaushal, 2 of the biggest stars of that era. And they play characters who are running away from Burma as the Japanese invasion is happening around 42, 43. And so they're passing through the Nagaland, Manipur, that area, and onto Tripura. And so this film has a lot of exotica. The tribals, the hill people are basically, there's a kind of Orientalism that goes on with them in their depiction. But eventually what is interesting is that because this is a movement of population that are running, they're refugees too, but in the Second World War, running from the Japanese invaders. there's a moment in which we see all these documentary footage that comes into the film. And at this point, the footage basically starts to seem like partition footage. In particular, I see this one image that was very telling for me because it felt like I had seen it somewhere else. And of course, I traced it back to this documentary that was put together by Films Division of India in 1985. The documentary was called The Agony of the Partition, A Challenge to the Nation. Now, this image is, you can see this, right?
Yes.
Okay, so the image is that of an infant on a back of a donkey among many, many refugees of the period. Now, it's no surprise that, there's a lot of footage from that population movement that exists because there were big international agencies that were on hand to document everything as India was becoming independent. But what is interesting is, in 1949, a movie gets made, Shabnam, about a population movement in 1942-43, running away from the Japanese invaders during the Second World War. And they can use footage from 2 years ago, from the partition movement of population. However, they still cannot make a film directly about the partition. So there's a kind of displacement that happens here. And I want to hold on to this as sort of an entry point into the way in which the partition as an event gets mediated in popular commercial films. It was a traumatic experience. We know this, right? Not only because of the loss of lives and homes and property, but also the tremendous disillusionment that resulted from the division, frustration of the longing for an independent nationhood, and the betrayal of passionate sacrifices of freedom fighters. Independence arrived, as I said famously, a moth-eaten dawn. The ideal of Akhand Bharat was not realized. In this scenario, fantasy had to emerge as a significant mode of elaborating and expressing arcane emotions unleashed by the collective disillusionment. Popular cinema's convoluted and melodramatic narratives, I think, are best seen as attempts to make sense of 1947, to manage painful and stranded memories of violence and fear, heartbreak and displacement. And it's really telling that so many times, and Gyan Pandey has written about this, when people talk about their memories of the partition, those who lived through it, they often pose questions like, can you believe this was happening to us? Could you imagine? Because it sort of feels like it's beyond imagination. And this kind of stupefied rhetorical questions, they point to a certain problem of comprehension, of narrativization, of representation. We know that the experience happened, but exactly how to make sense of it, how to turn it into a manageable narrative, that was a big challenge. Now, there were a few films, popular commercial films, in the first 25, 30 years, from like Lahore in 1948 to Chaliya in 1960, and there were others in between. Of course, on the other side, there's the Ghatak trilogy. There are 3 films made by Ritik Ghatak from 1960 to 1962 in a tremendous burst of creativity. But Ghatak's films are a little different, and I'm going to bracket that for the time being. What's really interesting is when I went to Bombay in 1997, 1998, doing research for my work, I talked to many people in the industry, but 2 people particularly stood out for me. And they were the 2 brothers, B.R. Chopra and Yash Chopra, both incredibly important directors and producers and industry stalwarts. B.R. Chopra told me flat out that there were not many films that were made about the partition, because the way he put it was, we were all ekattha, and he made this gesture of unity, right? And he says, then this division comes, and it was like being yanked away from your brother or yourself even. The bonds that were broken irrevocably were broken because of the violence and the uprooting, and no one really wanted to live through that again on screen. The memories were too raw, too fresh at that point. So it was not possible to really deal with the partition directly. But his brother, younger brother Yash Chopra, kept on saying to me that there were actually many cinematic representations in that period of the partition. But when I pressed him, he could give me only those few names of the 5 or 6 or 7 films that I already knew of, that everyone could tell me about. So my challenge became, how do I make sense of this kind of contradiction in the account of the two brothers? Actually, Yash Chopra's early career shows us a way. His very first film was called Dhul Ka Phool, roughly translated as Blossom in the Dust. From 1959, a very young Yash Chopra makes a film about a baby that's a foundling. The baby boy was abandoned, and he's brought up by these fakir, and not as a Muslim nor as a Hindu, but just as a human being. So it's clearly something that the narrative wants to make a case for this kind of syncretic upbringing and humanity as the basis for subsequent lifestyles and actions. Now, this was a big hit, his very first film. So he gets emboldened, right? 2 years later, he makes a movie called Dharamputra, a righteous son, or the religious son, or the son of the religion. This is 1961, where he actually goes directly to the idea of the partition. And here, what we see is Shashi Kapoor's character is again a foundling in one sense. Basically, a Muslim couple who are lovers, they are not married yet. And the woman gets pregnant and she gives birth, but has to give up the son because it's out of wedlock. So the son is brought up by her friends and neighbors, a Hindu couple. The son grows up to be a fanatic Hindu extremist, who at one point goes to kill her birth mother without knowing who she really is. So the 4 images that you have, sorry, the quality is terrible. The first one is where his foster mother is telling him, like, do you know who she is? She's your mother. And then the next one to the right, where he has this sort of lightning struck him face, and he's saying, Ma, like, how can it be mother? And the very next shot is that of falling debris, like in an earthquake, which is the third shot, the left on the bottom. And then it shifts to this fires and blood, and the song begins. Now, it's really interesting. Dharamputra was Nehru's favorite film. He asked everybody to go see it, but it was a huge flop because no one could really bother to, again, live through all the heartbreak right after 4 years. So Yash Chopra is very discouraged. He takes 4 years to regroup and comes back with a film that goes on to be the biggest hit until that moment. In 1965, he released Walked, or Time, in which it's still about a family falling apart and the members are dispersed and they come back together after many years, a very melodramatic kind of resolution of eventual union of the family. But what's interesting is when I spoke with him, he said that this was about the Quetta earthquakes in Baluchistan in 1935, It was a 7.7 magnitude earthquake, so it was very strong. At least 60 to 70,000 people died. What's interesting is I suggested to him, look, you in Dharamputra, when he finally realizes what his real identity is, that he was born to Muslim parents, and it's not about blood really, his whole world falls apart, and you show earthquakes, debris falling all over the place. And now you have made a film about the earthquake that separates the family. So don't you think it's a kind of allegory of Partition 2? Of course, I understand it's about the Quetta earthquake. And he basically looked at me and nodded his head and said, I don't know what you boys are talking about. So I think he made a move to allegory as a necessity at that moment. It was a certain kind of historical consciousness that was demanded by the moment. And we see this in film after film after film. He was right in one basic sense. Many films were made about the partition, even though they never directly talked about it, right? So you see countless films that have the word ghar or sangsar, like family or home, in the title. I counted at least 45, 6 in just a matter of like 7, 8 years in the 1950s.
Bhaskar, could I ask you, also in terms of time, because we will have a discussion period, if you could bring your presentation to a close in the next 1 or 2 minutes.
So what I'm suggesting is that there is a hermeneutic of mourning that comes into view if we take into account this initial silence, this kind of willful amnesia in most films, because what was paramount at that moment was the project of nation building, and no one wanted to dwell on the partition, right? But that doesn't mean that the memories go away. And they come back after 1984, after the riots in Delhi in 84 against the Sikhs. And because of certain revisionist histories, especially feminist historiographers talking to survivors of the partition. And then, of course, there was Gandhi, Richard Attenborough's Gandhi in 1982. And these events brought back the partition into mainstream discourse and cinematic memory. And then there was this huge number of TV shows and films made about the partition. So the hermeneutic of mourning, an initial period of silence, and then an outpouring of memories later on. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to have asked you to be so terse about something so expansive, but it is filled with insight that we'll have fun talking about as we get together. So now if we could turn to Nadhra. Is she ready to go? Excellent. Nadhra, so please, can you join us? We will open your slides now, and it would be great if we could see your face rather than mine.
Thank you very much, and apologies for the technical glitch. So mine is more of my personal experience, but let me just get going. Thank you, Jennifer, for hosting this session, and I'm grateful to the Mittal Institute for inviting me to this wonderful panel and for sharing the space with Iftikhar and Bhaskar. My association with the edited volume that Jennifer, you've been leading has been rewarding in many ways on both personal and professional fronts. And, kind of building on this personal is what I've put together today to share with everyone. So I will start by saying that as art and film, buildings, their ornamental programs and the role they have played in different historical moments evoke emotions and seek response from their viewers and users. I find Sylvan Tompkins' SAR, which is Stimulus, Effect, Response framework, very useful to investigate the role of architecture in shaping people's cognition and behavior. It also helps me explore the didactic and assertive character of built spaces in communicating the role expected of them by their builders. Effect. A word hailing from the Latin noun effectus was generally understood to describe the rush of emotions until the 17th century philosophers, René Descartes and Baruch Spinoza drew attention to its agency in transforming thoughts, distinguishing it from the restrictive reference to only evoking emotions. And then we have Bergson and Gilles Deleuze, who've applied it to aesthetics and literature. I use affect to navigate the visual vocabulary of building designs, materials, their ornamental schema, inscriptions announcing their identity and negotiations with time, and their references in texts to understand different phases of their lives. I believe that each ocular sensation has the power to speak by engaging imagery as an illustrative mechanism, literally or metaphorically. This information acts as a stimulus, creates sensations or effect, and set the viewer's thoughts into motion. Each chosen medium serves dual purposes. While visual references stand in aid to textual sources, every textual narrative recalls visual compositions it describes. The thoughts they activate, therefore, dash on both planes. The experience of a variety of sensations with the capacity to summon mental engagement that carries the potential to lead to the act of thinking is best explained by Gilles Deleuze in the following words, and I quote, "It mobilizes the memory, it sets the soul in motion, but the soul in its turn excites thought, transmits to it the constraints of the sensibility, forces it to conceive essence as the only thing which must be conceived." Before going forward, let me just give you a bit of a context of my understanding of partition and the role of built spaces. I grew up listening to my mother's eyewitness accounts of partition horrors as an 8 or 9-year-old when she migrated from Ludhiana to Lahore. As a result, partition unfolded sentiments in my heart and mind that connoted division, rejection of the other, and horror. Then I chose, quickly fast forward, then I chose the Sikh Maharaja Ranjit Singh Samadhi or funerary monument as a case study for my PhD dissertation. With the handed down partition memories, I assigned myself the task of virtually reclaiming the lost architecture material of the numerous dilapidated Mughal monuments in and around Lahore. The Maharaja was accused of ruthlessly pillaging during the 19th century. What shocked many was the fact that my finished dissertation was in complete contradiction to my initial plans. It was built as an advocacy campaign for assigning Sikh period architecture as a place of honor in the history of Punjab. Now, when I look back, I realized that somewhere along the initial studies, the Samadhi stimulated empathy and affect for the human agency behind it and other contemporaneous built spaces. And in response to this effect, the walls of apathy, anxiety, and othering collapsed, transforming my worldview forever. Writing my paper for the partition volume enriched me in a similar way. It not only introduced me to several post-partition memories laced with nostalgia, it also inspired me to start reading some buildings erected or inhabited by Lahore's prominent pre-partition Hindu and Sikh residents. Carrying traces of decay and marks of mutilation and division by their post-partition residents, these built spaces still tenaciously display signs of their pre-partition lives. These buildings have never ceased to be mnemonic structures, reminding us of their absent Hindu and Sikh owners. The Lala Lajpat Rai Bhavan, this is an old photograph around 1934-35. And this is the one that I took a few years ago. This Lala Lajpat Rai Bhavan, standing on Lahore's Lower Mall Road, ever since my first encounter, has evoked sensations and effect that stimulated thought and thus response, exactly what Tompkins' SARs are meant to do. The Bhavan gave me a reason to widen the scope of partition remembrances. No less than a wide-angle lens. This building in particular gave me the wider field, bringing more frames in view. Actors inhabiting these frames showed me the freedom struggle as a collective effort to liberate the country and brought heroes I was never familiar with, such as Lala Lajpat Rai. Bhagat Singh and his comrades that I knew of became clearer and focused than ever before. It also brought a fresh understanding of the Ghadar movement, led me to the Stockton Gurdwara in California, where Sikh, Hindu, and Muslims Ghadarites are still commemorated, are all commemorated and celebrated. Keeping the time constraints, I'll just sum up by saying that that buildings have played a pivotal role in shaping my worldview, and I believe they can do the same for dismantling several unconscious constructs for others. They have the power to create sensations or effects that stimulates thoughts, and these thoughts have the agency of bringing people closer. I would like to suggest that partition studies need to use a wider angle lens and allow built spaces to help us rethink and re-narrate the stories of freedom fighters, not for a single community, but for everyone who was in it. Also, that pre-partition buildings on both sides of the border be conserved and studied. They should be unmuted to tell us of their use as shared spaces, of occasions of collective mourning and rejoicing. And lastly, the moments of despair when these safest havens for their inhabitants were being vacated for safer places in the unknown land on the other side of the border. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Nadhra. And your economy of speech is appreciated, although I know you had to truncate some of the subtleties and some of the stories. Hitesh, Salman, how much time do we have?
My microphone? We can do about 5 to 7 minutes of questions or discussion.
Okay,
So,
so I
take a few.
won't summarize. The three of you have done an extraordinary job of conveying what I actually hadn't quite expected, the ways in which memory in a post-traumatic mode takes time to gel, to signify, for people to have the courage to actually come to terms with what they're feeling and thinking. And it is, it's a phenomenon that, with the exception of World War I, where you had the poets writing in the midst of war, but take the huge rupture in the United States of America, quote unquote, which is the American Civil War. It took 30, 35, 40 years before you began to see any significant literature coming out of the Civil War. And the divides in this country, I'm not equating it with partition only in the sense that it is a border that has defined difference and ongoing difference in ways that are very difficult for us now to negotiate. So that the ways in which you have spoken about memory and how we need to take advantage of the fact that this is third generation and fourth, to me are very, very helpful in looking at the historical record that each of you as artists is bringing to the fore and making it very difficult for us to deny. So I'm most interested in the few questions we might have before we proceed with the next part of the program. And so perhaps we could open the mic. Yes. Please, go ahead, yeah. Introduce yourself just very briefly. Name, yeah.
Sure. Hi. Thank you for all those really interesting discussions. My name is Barul Kalbag. I'm a secondary history teacher in New York City. And my question for you is, I guess it's not directed to anyone in particular, but anyone that could answer it. But as the generation of people that actually experienced partition is passing, and I know there's been tremendous effort to collect stories all across South Asia and even amongst South Asians outside of South Asia. But there's also this like wealth of scholarship now on partition that is available to anyone that's interested. Do you think that how artists, whether in film or visual arts or address partition will be different? Have you observed changes in how they engage with partition themes and experiences because they're relying not on necessarily even the memories of people they know, but on secondary sources?
It's a very good question. I would just modulate it by saying it's secondary sources, but it's also received memory and received reverberations that were unvoiced when they were children. So it's extraordinary how this works. But maybe Bhaskar, could you respond to that? Because you brought it up very explicitly.
So I'm thinking of Marianne Harsh's work on post-memory. Subsequent generations who have not actually lived through the event, nevertheless have a very strong memory of the Holocaust, for instance. It depends on how much is done to archive those memories in terms of, maybe recording of testimonials and stuff like that. There is now one partition museum in Amritsar, and there is an attempt to start a second one in Calcutta. But, I think as far as I can tell, there is no big change. Maybe there's a certain kind of sublation that goes on, like as a trace, it's maybe more indirect now. But it was indirect to begin with. So I think it will be that the 90s and the first decade of this century were the anomalous moments in partition memorialization. In the arts, it's a little different. In cinema, if you think about Iftikhar, he was really fighting the willful forgetting by absolutely obsessively returning to the partition trauma over and over again. And he was actually not returning to the trauma itself, but the effects of it. He refused to kind of let go of the effects. He wanted to have it centrally in his films. And I think this kind of melancholic investment in these memories can be useful in fighting amnesia. But in terms of the popular narratives, even though they are helping us, they help us engage with the experience in all kinds of interesting ways, some of which are not in the control of the filmmakers themselves, as in the case of Yash Chopra. I think there's a kind of unconscious or subconscious dimension that comes into play. But I think there, the ultimate resolutions are rather pat. They're very ideological. If you just look at these films like Border or 1942, A Love Story, they take you somewhere eventually. That's not that exciting. It's a process on the way. What you have to kind of experience or re-experience, that's more interesting.
Nadhra, you mentioned briefly the explosion in your understanding of partition by looking at the buildings that were occupied by the liberation movement, the anti-colonial movement in British India, undivided India, that were there not very well enshrined. There are few photographs and there's not a lot of placards, but those buildings that still exist in Lahore, and I'm not going to ask you to comment. I'm just bringing it out to say that it is that the buildings themselves need to be looked at. This is that you're setting up a flag, that architecture will evoke understandings that you have no idea about. And it's extremely important for, the architectural docents that are bringing people around the city to say, this is what happened here in 1935. So that's a lesson to all of us, that buildings keep a story. Even fussed over and redone and left dusty. It's great.
May I add?
Iftikhar, sorry?
Yeah, I wanted to just
Yes,
say
I
that.
was going to ask you to have the last comment. Is that okay?
Yeah, no. Regarding the question of generations, I think in terms of visual art, as I mentioned, there were modernists like Tayyab Mehta and Satish Gujral who made work that you can think about in relation to partition. But the question is that also, there is also this post-memory and second and third generation transmission of memory, but also that the modality has changed in terms of, because contemporary art is a very different, has a very different modality, both in terms of its medium, but also in terms of its claims to eventfulness, than modernism does. Because modernism is about transcendence and universalism and making a permanent kind of a resolution on a canvas. Whereas the contemporary artwork, first of all, it's very diverse in terms of different mediums. And the second issue is that it is not transcendental in its claims, but more immanent. So that makes a big difference in terms of how artists can relate to, the fractures, divides, and, aporias of selfhood and society, in the wake of partition.
Thank you. So there are new languages we have to learn.
Yeah.
If we're looking at contemporary art and its treatment of the past, or at least this past. Thank you. Thank you for that. Thank you all for brilliant and discussions from your own perspective that unexpectedly cohere more than I had thought it would. So I think we should bring this to a close. We are about to have an eminent speaker, and Amartya Sen is entered the room. And so I will bring this to a close and thank you all very much for your presentations, and thank the audience for your very good attention.